Content warning. This story contains themes of child loss, abduction, and violence, handled without graphic detail. The phone rang like an accusation at 2 in the morning. Gabriel Lawson answered on the third ring with the practiced calm of a man who had built silence into every hour of his life, an absence of surprise that was itself armor. The voice on the other end was thin and clinical, the sort that lives in hospital corridors and says only what the law allows. "Mr. Lawson, I'm calling from St. Augustine. There's been an incident involving your son. I'm so sorry." The rest of the words slotted into Gabriel the way a bone finds its socket, small, precise, inevitable. He clutched the receiver as if it were the edge of a cliff. He should have moved. Instead, he sat very still and felt the rooms around him. The tower's glass panes, the city's river lights, the distant hum of engines, sudden extras to a private rupture. Noah, 6 years old, with a list of favorite dinosaurs and a habit of hiding under the dining table when storms came, was the single human thing he had not managed into a ledger. Everything else had been fit into schedules and strategic plans. Hotels that rose like glass altars, a family name reinforced like a brand. Noah had been harder to manage. He hung up. The elevator ride down from the 46th floor was a measure of time with no meaning. Wall panels reflecting a man who looked composed, who had always been able to command rooms, and now felt the weight of a small, ordinary absence like gravity itself. At the hospital, the corridor smelled of disinfectant and cold coffee. Dr. Evelyn Cross met him with a face that refused pity and offered it anyway. "Mr. Lawson," she said, steady, "we did everything we could." The sheet over the small body was white and deliberately unremarkable, a start that was supposed to make endings neat. Gabriel had to tell himself to breathe. He noticed, absurdly, the tiny curl of Noah's hair on the pillow, and the way a little hand had been arranged as if it might still clutch a toy. The nurse's voice receded. The room contracted to the space between Gabriel and the impossible silence under the sheet. He felt the old habits fall away, the calculation, the negotiation. A rawness settled into him, and with it a clarity that had nothing to do with strategy. He wanted someone, anyone, to be to blame. Before he let himself move fully, before grief hardened into a plan, there was a detail that did not belong. A damp napkin, discarded near the corridor, stamped with the embossed logo of a lakeside club he knew. A child's anchor, embroidered on a pair of trunks, tucked beneath a bench in the emergency room. Small, accidental things have a way of refusing closure. He saw, in a flash that was more instinct than thought, how a father's life that had been built on clarity might take that single anomaly and begin to follow it. Stay until the end. If this piece matters to you, subscribe and leave a like. There's more coming. Gabriel did not trust his hands, so he trusted his eyes. The anchor on the trunks, blue on white, was the kind Noah loved. It was silly, childish, awful confirmation. He took a picture because pictures had a habit of keeping memory honest. Daniel Pierce arrived quietly, in a suit too plain to stand out, the kind of attorney who softened each peril with a plan. "We should do a full autopsy," Daniel said. "Independent pathologist, chain of custody. I'll call Frank." Frank Doyle, who had once been an investigator for a federal office and now worked as Gabriel's blunt instrument when the family needed muscle touched by law, would know where to begin. That night, a procession of formalities began. Paperwork, the soft clack of keys, a press office offering statements that felt small and dishonest. Gabriel sat in his office with the city like a bruised horizon below, and thought of the ledger of moments he had not kept. The time he canceled Noah's first soccer game to fix an opening, the meetings he took during bedtime stories. Guilt is a bad advisor, but it is frequently the one that stays. There was something else. In the photographs sent from the hospital, in the pool of urchin light that hospital fluorescents make, someone had taken a quick shot with a phone. A reflection in the glass of a sedan window caught the silhouette of a man wearing a watch with an odd emblem. A twin-wing motif encircling a stylized K. Gabriel's chest tightened at the emblem. He had seen similar designs in places that mattered. The watch signet of Alderan King, a private member's compendium of influence, a winged insignia that marked the sort of people whose misdeeds were usually buried like fossils. Noah's death should have been a closed book when the coroner's final report came in. Asphyxia listed as the cause, an unfortunate accident by the poolside. But Daniel, with his lawyer's skepticism, read the lines like a man wary of ink. Autopsies can be interpreted to fit a narrative, he told Gabriel. We need an independent read. A second look will buy us time to see if anything else matches. A photograph, a napkin, small things, they link events. That link was a string with knots. The anchor on the trunks, the watch emblem, the logo on the napkin. Each small object had an owner who wanted tiny things to remain unobtrusive. Gabriel felt, with a growing fever, that the thing he loved most had been lost in a system that preferred neatness to truth. The first lead was a receptionist at the Lakeside Club, who, after persuasion and a subtle exchange of favors, produced a security photo. The picture was grainy and prone to the distortions of night, but in it a little figure stood near the pool, towel wrapped around his shoulders, and a man with the winged watch emblem was talking to another man whose face leaned like a stone pool. The caption read, "Private rental, late entry." Who rented it that night? Gabriel asked. The usual, Alderan King members, or their guests, said the receptionist. This one was booked under a corporate name, Aldridge Holdings. Aldridge Holdings. A shell name in any other hands, but in Gabriel's world it fit like a missing piece. He scrawled the name on an envelope with a shaking hand, and in that instant the imperative shifted. Grief braided into a hunt. Frank arrived with a duffel and a demeanor that smelled of gasoline and late-night diners. He had the comfort of routine. "You want to find who was at that pool the night your son died," he said. "We'll find them. We'll follow the money first. These people leave ledgers like trophy cases." He set up a makeshift command in one of Gabriel's older conference rooms. A whiteboard, a stack of subpoenas, a laptop with tabs that looked at wire transfers and parking records. The investigation was at first methodical. Forensic accountants combed Aldridge's filings and found transfers that defied usual corporate behavior. Small, frequent payments to shell accounts that led, finally, to an array of trust funds under names that meant nothing outside private islands and tight-lipped trustees. GPS data from the club's parking readers showed one plate belonging to a car registered to a front company, ironically named Fallner Consulting. Colin, Gabriel's brother, had been acting as a liaison on a deal with Fallner Consulting, arrows pointing back into the family. He said he was on the West Coast for a venture, Colin told Gabriel when they met in the study, eyes honest in a way that suggested rehearsal. "I handled a lot while you were." His voice trailed into the easy excuses of family men who live by reputations. Gabriel watched the gestures he once trusted and felt them hollow. "We can handle this quietly," Colin said, a suggestion that tasted like denial. Gabriel's world had always protected itself with silence. It had been the bedrock of enterprise, discretion, privacy, unquestioned loyalty. It had also been its rot. The more he looked, the more he saw the same pattern. Favors disguised as invoices, donors whose names were absent from ledgers, employees whose contracts contained non-disclosure clauses like handcuffs. Between the cold prints of accounting spreadsheets and the warmer, messier repository of memory, two truths competed. One was the public story, a child's tragic accident that would be placed gently in the world's mouth with condolences and a closed door. The other was a dark alley of possibility that suggested deliberate hiding. Gabriel felt the old calculus of risk now governed by something more urgent than business continuity: justice. Maya Brooks came like a shard of light through that dark. Daniel found her first, while following a lead through a community outreach center where Gabriel's charity had donated to a summer swim program. She was 9, perhaps 10, small, coiled, the kind of child who keeps more observations than toys. The center director, a woman with a face that had been softened by years of care work, led Daniel to a supply closet where Maya sat with a bandage on her knee and a stack of crayons. Her eyes were dark and unassuming. "She said she'd seen something," the director said. "I thought she was remembering another kid, but she described the trunks, Mr. Lawson. She said she remembers an anchor." Maya's testimony was simple and crystalline. She had been in the parking lot that night, waiting for a cousin, when she saw a small boy with an anchor on his trunks near the pool. A man had called to him. He had walked away with the man, and later she had heard a raised voice. Her account was concrete in the way of things small people notice: the color of the towel, the way the man's watch glinted like a blinking bird, the smell of chlorine. Gabriel met Maya in the center's tiny office. She did not look up when he entered. She clutched a stuffed bear whose fur had been worn soft by use. "You knew Noah," she said before he could speak. Her voice was precise. "He had a dinosaur shirt. He liked the deep end." The way she named him as if he were still present did something to Gabriel that no official document could have done. It brought Noah back in the particularity of a child's habits and preferences. It gave the grief a face again. "She remembers a watch," Daniel said later, watching Gabriel watch the child. "And the anchor on trunks. She's observant. Children see what adults edit out." Maya's perspective was not mystical. It was practical. She described that man's shoes, scuffed. Then the way his watch reflected the pool lights. In her speech there was an economy, an instinct for survival honed by years of being overlooked. Gabriel found himself wanting to protect her the way a parent protects a child who carries truth like contraband. The more evidence Daniel and Frank assembled, the more resistance surfaced. Colin became evasive in meetings. Fallner, the wealthy man whose name now mattered like a hard knot, answered Gabriel's calls with the kind of affability that has no sweat. "Gabriel," Fallner said once, voice a surface sheen, "this is a tragedy, but we must be careful with these narratives." Careful, Gabriel thought, meaning careful for them. Money bought discretion. It bought silence. It also bought men who thought consequences were only for the public to bear. Gabriel felt his old empire tilt. The glass towers that had felt like destiny were suddenly fragile in the face of things he could not simply buy away. The investigation deepened into a montage of small surgical strikes. Frank took photographs of delivery logs and matched them to times. A forensic accountant found a transfer labeled for events that corresponded to a dinner in the week leading to Noah's death. Wire transfers skimmed through shell companies before pooling in an account tied to a property in a remote stretch of lakefront. Daniel subpoenaed the club for guest lists and was met with lawyers who preferred to treat subpoenas like invitations to delay. A pathologist called by Daniel, a woman named Dr. Renee Malik, read the autopsy with a patience that felt like an interrogation of ink. She found inconsistencies, bruising that did not fit the stated timeline, a blood type discrepancy in some notes, a sampling chain that was loose at best. It was not proof of anything criminal, she cautioned, but it was enough to demand questions. Coroners can be very good at telling you what they saw, and very bad at telling you what it means, she said. Her voice was even. You need more data. And so Gabriel began to gather data as if assembling a new language. He pored over security footage, traced plates, subpoenaed parking logs. He bought in the city's oldest private investigator through Frank, a man named Carlos Ruiz who smelled faintly of cigars and had a notebook filled with names. Carlos followed plates through parking garages and matched them to receipts at a private club off the lake. He found a man who rented the small rear cottage on the property the week before. The name on the contract was a trust associated with Aldrich Holdings. There were moments when the old Gabriel came back, the businessman who could see the meeting room as a chessboard. He positioned a press release and a legal strategy simultaneously. He arranged for a foundation statement that would memorialize Noah without admitting doubt. He also directed Daniel to prepare a motion to appoint a special investigator. In the private hours, he allowed himself a kind of fury that was clean and useful. Lists of targets, timetables, a sense that truth could be excavated. But investigation is not only lists. It moves through human cruelty and the small mercies that interrupt it.
Maya's presence was both. She offered a drawing to Gabriel at the center, a lighthouse drawn crookedly with a small shape beside it. She pointed to the figure and said he was brave. The simplicity of it was ridiculous and necessary. Gabriel kept that drawing in his pocket beside his phone. It was nothing he could spend or trade. It was everything that mattered. The deeper they dug, the more Gabriel's world revealed fissures. Colin's name was in emails that suggested meetings at Fallner's lake property. A ledger entry, half hidden in a bank statement, showed a payment from Fallner to a vendor supplying life jackets and children's swim equipment, an odd expense that was labeled event safety. The implication was not yet a crime, but it was a point on a map. Gabriel found himself in places that no longer fit his comfortable orbit. Shelters, outreach programs, a juryless room in the back of a community center where volunteers mourned with him in honest silence. He listened, awkwardly and humbly, as people told him about the work his foundation had done and how it had sometimes seemed like a way to buy peace.
Those conversations lodged in him like stones waiting to be shaped. At night, after the command center had quieted and the city lights kept their slow vigilance, Gabriel walked the Riverwalk alone. Snow began to fall in thin, hesitant flakes that night, turning neon into a watercolor smear. He looked up at the glass towers and thought of how transparent they appeared, then how impenetrable they really were. The snow fell like small absolutions. He thought of the lighthouse Maya had drawn, an instrument that did not judge but simply showed the way, and felt the image settle into him, softening the hard edges. He started to imagine a life that might include admission and reparation rather than concealment. Then, in a burst of movement that felt both precise and reckless, Frank located a surveillance copy from a diner by the club that had recorded a vehicle arriving late and leaving with a single child and man. The plate number was partial, but enough to chase. Frank drove through the night, his hands moving like the instrument he was, and found a registration that linked a car to a trust under the name of a man who, on paper, should never have been present at such a place at such a time, Richard Fallner. Confrontations followed, sharp and brittle as broken glass. Gabriel flew to the estate ostensibly to demand answers and found Fallner in a study that smelled faintly of old leather and expensive lemon oil. Fallner's smile was a lesson in calm. "Gabriel," he said, folding his hands as if in prayer, "I send my condolences." "You were at the club," Gabriel said. It was not a question. The voice that answered was a blade. Fallner did not deny seeing a man that night with a watch like his. He claimed to have been at a charity event. "The city is full of similar watches," he said, and the words were meant to diffuse. But the photographs, the anchor on a small trunk, the partial plate, they compacted into something heavier than denial. Colin's story splintered under pressure. He had told small lies, protective at first, but under Gabriel's insistence he started to reveal pieces. Meetings with Fallner, conversations about safety measures, a promise that the club would be closed to press. "I thought I was protecting what we'd built," he said, and the sentence was a confession in the way confessions often are. The heart finally unlatched. As accusations gathered, the public world leaned in. Stock prices wavered. News anchors placed polite condolences into narratives of tragedy. Gabriel found the old tools did not placate this new hunger. The legal route moved forward with a fury of subpoenas and sealed motions. Federal investigators, alerted by the pattern of transactions and the presence of possible obstruction, began to probe the shell companies. A thin, urgent network of people who once moved in silence was now under a public microscope. In the midst of that exposure, a shift happened that even Gabriel had not anticipated. A private security camera from Fallner's estate, one that had been assumed to have been wiped as part of normal estate protocol, was found to have an old backup. Someone, a cleaner, a guard with a guilty conscience, had stored footage on an external drive that showed a man outside the cottage at the lake the night before Noah's disappearance. He was alone for a while, then a child stepped out of the shadows, and a small interaction occurred that no one had foreseen. The child, still wearing trunks with an anchor, resisted briefly, then was led away. The footage was grainy, but the watch emblem blinked. The footage did not explain motive, but it reframed the story entirely. Gabriel watched the footage with a focus that emptied the room. His hands did not shake as much as his guts tightened. Later, in the quiet aftermath, Dr. Malik read the camera time codes and cross-referenced them with the club's logs. There was a discrepancy, a 15-minute window that had no corresponding entry in the official logbook. The discovery suggested not a simple oversight, but an omission. The legal wheels turned. Arrests were not immediate. There is a slow choreography to indictments when power and lawyers assemble. But the public line shifted. For Gabriel, the process served a different function. He wanted more than conviction. He wanted accountability, and the word had begun to mean to him something larger than the imprisonment of a single man. It meant restoring the junction where wealth met responsibility. It meant, arguably, changing the architecture that allowed a child to slip through the grid. Maya was reassured into a foster arrangement that was cautious and protected. She continued to attend the center and to come with Daniel to answer questions, drawing the lighthouse each time like a talisman. Noah's body was returned, and Gabriel, who once measured success by occupancy rates, now counted breaths and allotted them like treasures. He sat in a small funeral chapel with a few close friends and family, and the world outside moved as if the business of the city could be rolled up and set aside. He did not want the world to move on. He wanted it to bend. Yet the human heart keeps odd rhythms. Gabriel found himself channeling his devastation into exactness. He met with forensic accountants, with a prosecutor who had been patient and precise, and with Frank, who turned his bluntness into a weapon against obfuscation. The prosecution prepared a case that threaded wire transfers to a vendor invoice to an estate payment. They developed a timeline that matched camera footage to witness statements. The world of reputation that had once insulated men like Fallner began to crack in ways that were both legal and financial. Shareholders demanded meetings, a board was unsettled by questions of governance. Between the spreadsheets and the legal briefs, Gabriel made another choice that surprised his advisors.
Noah was small, frightful, and hysterical when an agent opened the door, and then he was, astonishingly, also alive. Gabriel remembers the moment with an almost unbearable clarity. The bureaucratic lull of boots on concrete, the flash of a badge, the long exhale when a child steps into daylight and does not collapse into absentness. He took Noah into his arms like a man who had been recalibrated by mercy and terror simultaneously. The hospital declared it a miracle, because the language of medicine yields to relief with open hands. Gabriel knew better than to call anything miraculous. He could account for the rational sequence that had led them to the storage unit. Still, when Noah reached up and grabbed his shirt, small fingers clutching the fabric of a father who had strayed from simpler duties, Gabriel felt a kind of repair begin. Noah was shaken, of course. He had been through trauma, and recovery is not a straight line. Doctors insisted on care, counseling, gradual reintegration. Maya, who had watched from the center with the stubborn patience of children who keep vigilance, met Noah one afternoon with crayons and a small drawing of 2 anchors, one for Noah and one for her. In the drawing, they stood side by side near a lighthouse. The image was both naive and exact, the child's metaphor for safety and the small hands that could hold another's truth. The public fallout intensified. Arrests followed for a handful of people implicated directly in the concealment. Indictments sought to pierce the protective layer around Fallner. Stockholders organized. The board demanded transparency. Colin resigned amid scandal and later agreed to testify. Fallner fought. The courtroom became a place where humanity and law intersected in messy, consequential ways. The prosecutor displayed ledgers and photographs, and the defense tried to reframe the narrative into a tragic accident. The jury's faces were impassive as they considered the evidence humans leave behind. Through all this, Gabriel's life reoriented toward a new axis. He did not let revenge guide him. He pursued accountability and structural change. He restructured the foundation and put in place trustees who were neither family nor sycophant. He mandated external audits and created an independent oversight committee with community representatives, an idea he had scoffed at in the past but now embraced as a necessity. He began to attend meetings at the community center, not as a donor with talking points, but as someone who listened, and sometimes as someone who asked how else he could use his resources to right small wrongs. The final legal outcomes, when they arrived in fits and starts, did not erase what had occurred. Men were convicted for a range of crimes, from obstruction to criminal negligence. Others pleaded and took plea deals.
Colin entered a guilty plea for misprision of a felony and cooperated with the prosecution, his testimony slicing away the polished defenses that had once seemed so impermeable. Faulkner, after a staggered legal battle, faced significant charges and the near inevitable unraveling of influence he had relied upon. The law moved imperfectly but effectively, a progress measured in incremental justice rather than theatrical closure. What changed most, quietly, was the texture of Gabriel's days. He traded some of his time to the foundation and to personal restitution projects. He funded scholarships aimed at providing safe after-school programs and swim lessons with certified lifeguards. He instituted job programs for parents in neighborhoods like Maya's, understanding that prevention is not only about fences, but about opportunity. He formed a partnership with the community center that promised long-term funding and oversight, with transparent reporting and a board seat for community members. Maya's life altered too. She accepted a scholarship for school and later joined a youth advisory panel formed to ensure that programs actually served the needs of children. She became, in small ways, a voice of resilience. Not famous, not sanctified, but present. She and Noah carved out a cautious friendship. Noah's recovery was painstaking. Nightmares, therapy, slow reacquaintance with the pleasures of childhood. Gabriel learned to read the subtle signals of progress. A laugh that lasted longer, the way Noah's hand reached for a book instead of a tablet. The final public gesture was not a grand speech, but a mural. Commissioned in collaboration with youth from the center, it rose on the side of a community building where the lighthouse Maya had drawn took shape in bright paint and clean lines. The mural showed a lighthouse with two anchors below, tiny, near the base. Beneath it was a simple inscription in block letters: "We remember, we guard." The painting was cleaned and vivid against the urban gray, an image of repair rather than moralizing. On a winter morning, when the city had been washed with new snow, Gabriel walked with Noah to the river and paused near the mural. The child's breath puffed in small clouds. Gabriel thought of all the things he had believed success would bring: control, answerability, the capacity to arrange outcomes, and he conceded their limits. What remained was work, public, painstaking, often thankless, and deeply necessary. The final reform in his mind was not a press release, but an admission at a board meeting. He apologized, not for earnest PR, but for the absence that had made avoidable harm possible. He stepped back from roles that concentrated power and implemented rotating leadership on key decisions. Some members of his circle left awkwardly, others stayed. The business faltered in small markets where he once directed growth aggressively, but it endured. The company's new ethos, transparency, community representation, and legal oversight became a slow, expensive, yet meaningful realignment. There were no perfect endings. Nights came when Gabriel still woke to the memory of a small chest rising and falling, and sometimes the pain would hit with the force of a storm. He learned the discipline of patience, listening to Noah's uneven sentences at dinner, learning the sound of his laughter, the cadence of his apologies if he pushed boundaries unaware. He learned that rebuilding was a domestic task as much as a public one. And yet, in the small triumphs, the mural unveiled, Maya awarded a scholarship to a school that promised stability, the foundation's first transparent audit completed, Gabriel found a kind of redemption that felt earned rather than bestowed. The lighthouse image, repeated slowly in the landscape of his life, became a private map, a reminder that guiding light is not always heroic. Sometimes it is merely consistent and available. The story did not end with a tidy bow. There were legal appeals and speculative headlines, murmurs of opportunism, late-night calls from angry shareholders. But there was also Noah's drawing of 2 anchors taped to Gabriel's office wall, a small, ridiculous thing that made him smile on mornings he feared he could not continue. There was Maya's steady presence at the mural openings, her hand sometimes finding his in acknowledgement, never calling him savior. Change had been exacted through truth, through small voices insisting on being heard, through the slow unraveling of a protective network that had privileged power over children's safety. Gabriel learned to let the community's needs guide him in ways his old instincts never permitted. He did not recover what he had lost in innocence, but he found a vocation that permitted grief to be articulated as work that might prevent another child from being lost. In the end, the tower glass reflected a different man, someone who had traded domination for stewardship, who kept tabs not on market share but on the number of children reached by safe after-school programs. On a cold morning when the last snow of the season softened the city's angles, Gabriel stood with Noah and Maya at the mural and watched children run a small race along the riverwalk. Laughter rose, bright and unrehearsed. Gabriel felt a steadiness that had nothing to do with empire and everything to do with a slow, mutual repair. He had been devastated. He had been remade by the smallest of voices and the insistence of truth. He had found, like the lighthouse in Maya's drawing, that the role of someone in power could be to cast light rather than shadows. It was a modest transformation, but it was real. The work, as always, continued. On an ordinary Thursday, when the river thawed enough for the first gulls to return, Gabriel found himself kneeling with a paintbrush in his hand.
His suit lay folded on a nearby chair. His sleeves were rolled, forearms streaked with blue. Around him, a ring of volunteers, teachers, parents, a pair of kids from the after-school program, filled in the lower edge of the mural where winter had nicked the paint. Maya moved among them with the easy authority of someone who had earned a place by steady labor rather than titles. Noah stood a little apart, holding a battered soccer ball, watching his father with an expression Gabriel could not read and did not need to name. Someone laughed at a clumsy stroke he'd made. Gabriel laughed too, and felt the sound loosen something inside him. He was still learning the mechanics of small apologies, the simple admission when one had taken more than a turn at the brush, the patient listening when someone else told a story that made him uncomfortable. He learned how to stay when people asked questions he could not answer cleanly. He learned to let the discomfort sit in the room like an honest guest, rather than a thing to be smoothed away. Letters and legal filings continued to arrive at the office, the kind of paper that insisted the past remained a ledger to be balanced. He read them at a table in the back, while the front line of activities, tutoring sessions, hotline trainings, neighborhood walks, unfolded under the mural's protected light. The company no longer dominated his days. It occupied certain hours. The rest were parceled out to committee meetings in church basements, to grant applications with unfamiliar languages, to late-night calls with social workers who knew how to say things that bypassed his instincts and went straight to the practical. Maya asked him once, quietly, whether he believed he had become the kind of man the community could rely on. He could have given a sermon about stewardship. Instead, he said that he was trying, and that trying had become the work. Noah, overhearing, came up and pressed his small cheek against Gabriel's shoulder. It was nothing dramatic. It was a small, irrevocable claim. At the Riverwalk, the lighthouse painted on brick glowed pale against the encroaching dusk. 2 anchors,
tiny and earnest, were tucked at its base. Children raced past, voices raw with joy. Gabriel watched them, counting, awkwardly, the number of faces he could name as safe. It was not enough. It might never be enough. But the list grew, slowly. One program, one trained leader, one complaint taken seriously. Until it formed something like a line of defense. He rose, wiped his hands, and joined the others in clearing the site. There were no grand absolutions, no neat reconciliations announced from podiums. The repair was ordinary, the folding of tarps, the sweeping of sand, the sealing of a crack in the mural with patient brushstrokes. As they worked, a steady wind moved down the river, carrying with it the sound of laughter and the hum of distant city life.
Gabriel felt, for the first time in years, that responsibility could be contiguous with humility, not a weight to crush, but a cord to be held with care. Night fell. The mural's lighthouse caught the lamp's light and threw it back in a quiet, predictable arc. The anchors at the base held the image in place. Gabriel stayed long enough to watch the last group of children disappear homeward. Then he walked with Noah beneath the streetlights, his son's small hand finding his in a gesture that needed no words. The city had not forgiven him, and perhaps would never fully do so. The courts and the columns would keep their tempers. But here, among the painted bricks and the people who had chosen to stay, the work moved forward, slow, patient, and luminous in its own imperfect way. Noah yawned and tightened his grip, sleep and the day's small excitements folding him inward. Gabriel kept walking, the sound of their footsteps punctuating the quiet, thinking of all the small oppositions that had become his life. A skeptical phone call from a board member, a handwritten note left at the office with a question that would not be easily answered, the quiet pity in a neighbor's voice. These were not the kind of blows that made headlines. They were the steady phrase that could undo a man if he mistook them for final judgment. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of work became a kind of prayer. Mornings were for meetings with caseworkers and teachers, afternoons for canvassing grants and negotiating the tangle of legal language that insisted on turning mistakes into absolutes. Evenings belonged to the mural. Children came with scraped knees and brilliant ideas. They claimed colors as if by right. Maya orchestrated the rehearsals. A tutor would teach math by the lighthouse steps. A retired nurse held a weekly clinic in the community room. A handful of teenagers organized a safe routes walk to school. Gabriel lent his hands where they were needed, and his mouth where humility would not turn to silence, a scarce commodity for him at first. Not all encounters ended gentleness. A man named Carlos, who had once managed distribution at Gabriel's old company, came to the mural one late afternoon and stood longer than anyone else. He had been a fixture in the neighborhood, good humor and a heavy hand at barbecues. He now wore a slender, wary smile, the kind of smile that keeps distance at the same time it offers it. Gabriel approached and found himself apologizing before he had fully named the reasons in his head. Carlos listened without interruption, then said, "I don't know what I want from you, Gabriel. Maybe I want you to keep listening." That demand was more exacting than any legal condition. It asked him to be present to uncertainty. The legal letters continued, requests for documents, depositions, the occasional terse summons. The courtroom hung in the background of his life like a weather pattern. He planned, he prepared, but he was no longer living exclusively under its forecast. When the hearing finally came, it was not the theatrical undoing some had predicted. It was a strange, bureaucratic thing conducted in a municipal room with fluorescent lights that flattened everyone a little. Gabriel sat at a long table, his attorney beside him, but his attention drifted to the people who had filled the benches behind him. A teacher with paint on her cardigan, a man in a work jacket who had volunteered to teach carpentry, Maya with her hands folded so still they could have been a statue. Noah had been given a seat near the front and held a small plastic figurine as if it were a talisman. He watched his father in silence, and Gabriel felt that small, paring down kind of courage that does not need applause.
When asked to speak, Gabriel did not rise with a rehearsed statement. He spoke plainly, not to the papers or the cameras that had been suggested would appear, but to the room. He acknowledged mistakes he had made, administrative lapses, trust misplaced. He named the things he did not know how to fix, and then he spoke of the things he had learned. The necessity of listening to those affected first. The need for external oversight, not as punishment but as protection. The importance of handing over power where others were better suited. He did not beg for forgiveness. He asked for partnership. Afterward, people murmured. Some were vindictive in private messages, some were skeptical, but others came forward to say what they had seen. A man who had come back and worked quietly, who had not fled the place where pain had been done. Maya, who had been at his elbow for months, told a neighbor she'd met at the shelter that he's been at the mural every week, sometimes longer than any of us. Those small testimonies did not erase anything. No paper can do that. But they formed a fragile counterweight. The hearing ended with a mixed ruling. Compliance measures were required, including independent audits and a community oversight board to which Gabriel's organization would answer. There was no public forgiveness handed down. There was process. For Gabriel, process would have to be enough. He expected, after the hearing, to feel lightened, as if a rope had been cut. Instead, he felt like a man who had traded a knot for a net. Accountability now meant that his days would be measured not only by what he intended, but by how others could verify it. He welcomed that. It was clearer work. Months passed. The oversight board met on Tuesday evenings, a disparate assembly of neighbors, church elders, and 2 representatives from a nonprofit that had agreed to mentor the organization. The meetings, at first clumsy, became steady. Gabriel took notes, sometimes with a pencil handed to him by curious small hands. Sometimes he spoke, sometimes he listened.
The legal team still required particulars, this internal control, that policy. But the community asked different questions. Will there be a counselor at the after-school program? How will funds for the safety patrol be monitored? Who will train the volunteers? These were the details that mattered to people walking their kids home at dusk. In that season, Gabriel learned new forms of labor. He learned how to invite critique without becoming defensive. He learned to set aside pride when a teacher's better plan worked and to give the credit. He learned, in small but real measures, to cede authority and create space. He also learned to accept that some losses would not be restored. The sleek leadership title at the company, for instance, had been replaced by a chair in a modest office that looked onto a courtyard where a swing hung crookedly. He found he could be content in labor that bore direct witness to the people served. Noah grew in the span of these months. He began to talk about school projects with a seriousness that made Gabriel proud. One evening, as they sat on the mural's step painting over a cracked blue wave, Noah asked an honest, steady question. "Dad, if people are mad at you, will they ever stop being mad?" Gabriel set down his brush and considered the child's face. He had answers of different sorts, legal, moral, theological, but settled on the simplest truth he could hold. "Maybe not all of them," he said, "but some will, and others will keep coming until the list of people who trust us grows." Noah looked at the lighthouse and then at the anchors, and the small boy's brow furrowed as if he were mapping a solution. "Then we keep making the list," he said, and smiled as if he had proposed an unbeatable plan. The mural became, instead of a symbol of public relations, an instrument of ordinary repair. A neighbor who had been wary at first began leading a walking group that watched the streets at night. A retired music teacher started a choir with the teenagers. Donations, small and irregular, trickled in from people who had watched the progress and wanted to contribute. None of it erased what had been done, but it altered the ledger in human terms. The city still had its columns and its caution. The courthouse remained a place where some questions were not yet settled. Yet for many who came to the mural, the place held a rhythm of tending that felt like hope. At times, doubt came unbidden. There were sleepless hours when Gabriel counted the letters and the cost and wondered if his presence could be more harmful than helpful.
At those times, Maya would find him in the small back office, the light slanting through blinds, and she would hand him a cup of tea as if such remedies could be adequate. They would stand in companionable silence, the kind that does not rush to fix but holds the line. One afternoon, when the hospital called with a request to consult about a community health fair, Gabriel felt a slow, patient gratitude. Not the vindication of headlines, but the steadier reward of being asked to do more where need existed. People still wrote angry posts, and some volunteers left. There was no neat reconciliation with those who had been harmed by past decisions. Some wounds were personal and would require time, therapy, distance. Gabriel reached out to those he could respectfully engage, offering meetings, apologies, and, critically, concrete steps to address systemic failures. Not all took him up on it. He accepted that there would be absences in the list of those he could claim as allies. But the list itself kept growing, not dramatically, but with a kind of persistence that surprised him. Years later, years in which the mural weathered rain and winter, and the anchors received new coats of paint as kids grew and learned to hold a brush, Gabriel found himself less preoccupied by the question of public redemption and more committed to the slow business of being useful. The oversight board had matured into a real check, sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes necessary. The programs they ran were not perfect. They were, however, dependable. A small scholarship fund had been established for neighborhood kids. A partnership with a local tech school offered summer apprenticeships. The hotline had a new coordinator who wore her patients like armor. On a late spring afternoon, with the river in a silver hurry and gulls threading the sky, Gabriel sat on the mural's lowest step with his hand over Noah's, who was nearly a teenager now and more likely to roll his eyes than to press his cheek. They watched a group of younger children try to paint a whale that ended up more akin to a playful balloon. Maya approached, carrying a stack of flyers for an upcoming job fair, and stopped to listen as the children argued about which color made the best sea. Gabriel felt a quiet contentment, a different thing than triumph. It had the texture of a steady chair. He stood, stretched, and walked to the lighthouse brick to inspect a small chip. He ran his fingers across the anchor at its base, the paint worn in one place where a child's hand had clung, and thought about anchors as both symbol and practice. An anchor holds not by resisting all motion, but by securing what needs to be kept from drifting. He had not been absolved by the city. He had not become a different man by magic. He had been, instead, bound to work that required ongoing attentiveness and the ready readiness to answer for his actions. A woman from the neighborhood, one who had once been a harsh critic, came by with a small jar of flowers. She set them at the base of the mural and, without preamble, said, "We still watch you, but we also see this. Keep the list growing."
Her tone was not fully reconciliatory, and not fully condemning. It was the language of people who had learned that repair requires both insistence and small mercy. Gabriel thanked her. He thought of all the pages he had signed and the forms he now revised, of the nights spent drafting policies with volunteers who taught him the meaning of plain procedure. As dusk settled and the mural's lighthouse took on the gentle authority of the lamps, Gabriel walked home with Noah at his side. He did not imagine a final moment of vindication or dramatic resolution. The past would remain, lodged in records and private griefs. It would shape the conversation he continued to have with the community and, sometimes, with himself. But the life he inhabited now, one of modest stewardship, of listening, of deliberate exposure to accountability, felt coherent with the measure of the harm he had acknowledged. At the end of the block, Noah turned and squeezed Gabriel's hand. "We made the list," he said, like a boy marking a small victory. Gabriel smiled, and the smile was both grateful and wary. There were more things to do. There always would be. But the mural glowed, children's laughter rose and fell like tide, and the anchors waited at the lighthouse's base, patiently holding the image in place. In that ordinary constancy, Gabriel found a kind of peace, not erasure of what had been, but a daily labor toward what might still be possible.